The knocking came first as a whisper against wood, then as fists, then as desperation made sound. Cora Stone stood in the underground chamber with her hand frozen on the iron bar that held the door shut. She was 17 years old. Her shoulder still ached from where the timber had struck her 6 weeks ago. The wound beneath her shirt only half healed. The scar would stay with her forever. She knew that now. Outside, the wind screamed like something dying. Inside, the temperature held steady at 56 degrees. It had been 56 degrees for 5 days straight, while the world above turned to ice and killing cold. The knocking came again, desperate, frantic. She recognized the voice. Silas Reed, the carpenter who had helped dig her out when the tunnel collapsed. The man who had looked at her with something she could not name when she showed him her grandfather's journal. The man whose wife had frozen to death 2 winters ago because he did not know what Cora's grandfather knew about the earth and its hidden warmth. But there were other voices too. Voices that had laughed. Voices that had called this hole in the hillside a grave that 2 foolish girls were digging for themselves. Voices that had said orphans should know their place. Behind her, 14-year-old Violet watched with wide eyes. The dog Scout pressed against Cora's leg and whined. The 3 horses shifted in the darkness, their breath steaming gently in the lantern light. Cora's hand trembled on the bar. She thought about betrayal. She thought about every foster home that had promised safety and delivered pain. She thought about 13 years without her grandfather, without explanation, without knowing why the only family she had left had abandoned her. She thought about how easy it would be to leave that door closed. The voice outside broke. A man who had never begged for anything was begging now. Cora closed her eyes and saw her grandfather's handwriting. The last page of his journal, written in ink that had faded to brown. "Trust the earth," he had written. And then, in smaller letters beneath, "Trust is the only warmth that lasts." Her hand moved before her mind decided. The bar lifted. The door opened. And everything that had been frozen began, finally, to thaw. But that door, that choice, that moment when hate and love stood balanced on a knife's edge, that came later. That came after 9 weeks of digging and doubt and learning that some knowledge can only be passed down through blood and stubbornness, and the particular kind of faith that looks like madness to everyone watching. This is how it began. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September of 1889, delivered to the foster home in Portland, Oregon by a lawyer whose shoes were too clean for the neighborhood he was visiting. Cora had learned to read people by their shoes. Clean shoes meant someone who did not have to work with their hands. Clean shoes meant someone who had never needed to understand dirt. She signed for the envelope with the careful signature she had practiced for years. Cora Stone. Not the name she had been born with, but the name that had stayed with her through 4 foster homes and 7 years of learning that love was something other people got to keep. The lawyer waited while she opened it. His face held the expression adults always wore when they looked at her and Violet. Pity mixed with relief. Relief that their tragedy was not his own. Inside was a deed. 60 acres in Granite County, Montana. A place called Ridgewater. A name she had heard her mother whisper once, a lifetime ago, before the fever took her and their father in the same terrible winter. 60 acres from a grandfather she had not seen since she was 4 years old. The lawyer cleared his throat. He told her that Henrik Stone had died in August. Pneumonia, they said, though it had taken him slowly, over months. He had been 73 years old. He had lived alone on that Montana land for 40 years. Ever since he came from Norway, with nothing but mining knowledge and a stubborn belief that the earth held secrets for those patient enough to learn them, Cora felt nothing. You cannot grieve a ghost. You cannot mourn a man who chose silence over family, who let his only granddaughters disappear into the foster system rather than claim them as his own. But then the lawyer said something that made her hand tighten on the paper. He said it casually, like it meant nothing, like it was just another detail in a transaction between strangers. He said Henrik Stone had told him the girls would need that land before winter came. He said the old Norwegian had been very specific about the timing. September, he had said. They must come in September, before the cold. Cora looked at Violet. Her sister sat on the edge of the narrow bed they shared, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light through the grimy window. 14 years old, and still small enough that people sometimes thought she was younger. Still soft enough that the world had not yet taught her to harden. Violet met her eyes, and Cora saw the question there. The same question that had lived between them since their parents died. Do we have anywhere else to go? They did not. That night, after the lawyer left and the foster mother had gone through their room looking for anything of value the inheritance might have included, Cora found a second envelope tucked inside the first, smaller, addressed in handwriting that trembled with age or illness or both. She opened it alone, in the bathroom with the door locked and the single bulb casting shadows that made the words harder to read. Granddaughter, it said. The Norwegian accent lived in the formation of the letters, in the careful precision of someone writing in a language that had never quite become native. I am sorry for 13 years of silence. I am sorry for abandoning you when your parents died. I am sorry for being a coward when you needed an old man's stubbornness. I was afraid of what I knew, afraid of what was coming for me, afraid that loving you would put you in danger. But now I am dying, and fear seems like a luxury I can no longer afford. So I am leaving you the land. Not as an apology, I do not deserve forgiveness, but as a tool for survival. Trust the earth, Cora. It will be warmer than any person who has ever betrayed you. Dig where I have shown you. Dig before December. Your life and your sister's life depend on it. There was more, but the ink had run there, as if water had fallen on the page. As if an old man had wept while writing words he would never get to say aloud. At the bottom, in smaller letters, you have my stubbornness in you. I see it in your eyes, even in the photograph they sent me. Use it. The world will call you mad. Dig anyway. Cora read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket closest to her heart. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a weakness people used against you. But something in her chest loosened, just a little, just enough to let her breathe deeper than she had in years. The next morning, she told Violet they were leaving. The train west took 4 days. They traveled with everything they owned in 2 canvas bags, and the clothes they wore. Cora spent the money she had saved from 3 summers of washing dishes and taking in mending. It was barely enough. They sat in the cheapest car, surrounded by miners heading to the copper fields and farmers' wives returning from visiting family in the city. Violet pressed her face to the window and watched America scroll past. Forests gave way to plains. Plains gave way to mountains that rose like broken teeth against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She did not ask questions. She had learned, as Cora had learned, that sometimes you just had to trust that the person who loved you was making the best choice she knew how to make. They arrived in Ridgewater on a morning when the autumn air tasted like winter's warning. The town was small, smaller than Cora had imagined. One main street with a general store, a church, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other buildings that looked like they had been standing since before Montana was a state. The land office clerk gave them directions to the stone property. 6 miles north, he said. Follow the creek until you see the low hill with the oak tree. The cabin is on the east side. He looked at them like the lawyer had looked at them. 2 girls alone. Orphans. Tragedy waiting to happen. Cora thanked him and did not explain. She had learned that explanations were just invitations for other people to tell you why your plan would fail. They walked. The bags were heavy, but Cora had carried heavier things. Behind them, she heard the clerk say something to someone else in the office. Something about the Stone Girls and the old Norwegian's land, and how it would be a shame when the bank took it. Come spring, she kept walking. The cabin appeared exactly where the clerk said it would. Small. 2 rooms, maybe 3. Logs chinked with moss and mud. A stone chimney that looked like it had been built by someone who knew how to make things last. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but the walls stood straight. Cora stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared. Something was wrong. Not wrong like danger. Wrong like a puzzle piece that did not fit the picture she had built in her mind. The cabin looked cared for. The grass around it had been cut recently. The windows were clean. On the front step sat a mason jar with wildflowers, fresh enough that they had not begun to wilt. Violet saw it too. She looked at Cora with a question in her eyes. Someone had been here. Someone had known they were coming. Cora pushed open the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled like pine soap and something else. Something that tugged at memories so old she could not quite name it. Pipe tobacco, maybe. Or the particular mustiness of old wool. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace with wood already stacked beside it. Through the doorway, she could see a second room, 2 narrow beds made up with quilts that looked handmade. Old, but clean. Waiting. On the table sat a leather-bound journal. Beside it, a kerosene lamp. Beside that, a folded piece of paper with her name written on it in the same trembling handwriting as the letter she carried over her heart. Cora picked up the journal first. It was heavy, thick with pages covered in drawings and notes and diagrams that looked like something between art and engineering. She opened it to a random page and saw a cross-section of Earth. Layers labeled in Norwegian and English both. Depths marked in feet. Temperatures noted in degrees. She flipped forward. More diagrams. More notes. A map of the property with X marks in 3 locations. And then, near the end, a drawing that made her breath catch. A tunnel. Sloping gently downward into the side of a hill. Measurements written beside it. 12 feet deep. Entrance facing south. A chamber at the bottom, large enough for animals and people both. And at the very bottom of the page, circled twice in ink that had been pressed hard enough to almost tear through. Hot spring 12 feet down. 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Use this before December, or you will die. Cora read it again. Then she opened the folded note. The handwriting was different. Older. A woman's hand, she thought. It said only, "I kept my promise to him. The cabin is ready. I am sorry I could not do more." It was not signed. Cora set the note down carefully. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the cabin with new eyes. Someone had cleaned this place. Someone had brought flowers. Someone had made beds for two girls who were strangers, who were orphans, who were the granddaughters of a man who had lived alone and died alone, and apparently had not been as alone as everyone thought. Behind her, Violet made a small sound. Cora turned and saw her sister standing in the doorway of the second room, one hand pressed to her mouth. Cora moved quickly. She found Violet standing beside the bed, staring down at something that lay on the pillow. A small carved wooden bird. A wren, maybe, or a sparrow. The kind of thing a man with rough hands might make during a long winter with nothing but time and loneliness for company. There were two of them, one on each pillow, waiting for granddaughters their maker would never meet. Violet picked up the bird and held it like it was made of glass. Her eyes shone with tears she was too stubborn to let fall. Cora recognized that stubbornness. She saw it every time she looked in a mirror. She put her arm around Violet's shoulders and pulled her close. They stood like that for a long time, two girls in a dead man's cabin, holding carved birds and trying to understand how you could be loved by someone you never knew. Outside, something moved. Cora tensed, then relaxed when she saw the dog. He was old, gray around the muzzle, moving with the careful deliberation of joints that ached. He sat down in the doorway and looked at them with brown eyes that held too much knowledge, too much waiting. Violet moved first. She always did when animals were involved. She knelt down slowly and held out her hand. The dog sniffed it once, then pressed his head against her palm and made a sound that was half whine, half sob. Cora found the collar, worn leather with a brass tag. Scout, it said, and beneath that, in letters almost worn smooth, Henrik Stone, Ridgewater, Montana. The dog had been waiting for weeks, maybe months, waiting for his person to come home, waiting for the end of something he could not understand. And now here were strangers who smelled like the man he loved, who had the same shape to their faces, who carried his blood in their veins. Scout pressed against Violet and trembled. She wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his fur and let the tears come. At last. Tears for parents she barely remembered. Tears for a grandfather she never knew. Tears for all the years of foster homes and unkindness and the particular loneliness of being a child no one wanted. Cora looked away. She walked back to the table and picked up the journal. She opened it to the page with the tunnel diagram and read every word her grandfather had written. Hot spring beneath the South Hill, geothermal heat rising through ancient rock, temperature constant regardless of season. The Norwegians knew this, he had written. The Swedes, the Finns, anyone who survived winters where the cold wanted to murder you. You dig down. You find the warmth the earth keeps hidden. You build your shelter there. Instructions followed. Precise measurements. Angles for the entrance to allow airflow without losing heat. Depth calculations. A ventilation system that used the temperature differential to pull fresh air down and push stale air up. It was beautiful. Elegant. The work of someone who understood stone and soil and the physics of survival with the intimacy of decades. At the bottom of the page, a final note. This land will be yours when I am gone. Use this knowledge before winter. Promise me. Promise me you will dig." Cora pressed her hand flat against the page. She felt the indent of the pen, the places where her grandfather had pressed hard enough to make the words permanent. She thought about the lawyer's strange comment, about flowers on the step and clean windows, about carved birds and a dog who had been waiting. Henrik Stone had known he was dying, had known his granddaughters would have nowhere else to go, had prepared everything, down to the last detail, for two girls he had never met, but had clearly never stopped loving. The abandonment had not been abandonment at all. It had been something else, something her 17-year-old mind was only beginning to understand. Sometimes love looked like leaving. Sometimes protection meant distance. She did not forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she understood him now. And understanding was its own kind of warmth. Violet appeared in the doorway, Scout pressed against her legs. Her face was blotchy from crying, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She asked what they were going to do. Cora looked at her sister. 14 years old, red-haired and freckled and small for her age. The only family she had left in the world. The only person she would dig for. The only reason that mattered. She held up the journal so Violet could see the tunnel diagram. "We are going to trust a dead man," she said. "We are going to dig." Outside, the September sun was already lower than it should be. The aspens on the hillside were turning gold. In the distance, geese flew south in formation. Every creature that understood winter was preparing, running or burrowing or storing what they would need to survive. Cora and Violet Stone were orphans. They had nothing but 60 acres, a dead man's journal, and each other. They had been abandoned, betrayed, and broken by a world that did not care whether they lived or died. But they had something else too. Something that ran in their blood from a Norwegian grandfather who survived winters that killed stronger men. Something Celtic and fierce from a mother who had been a teacher before the world took her. Something that looks like stubbornness to outsiders, but is really just the will to survive when survival seems impossible. The next morning, Cora picked up a shovel and walked to the South Hill where her grandfather's journal said the earth kept its warmth. Violet followed with a wheelbarrow and Scout at her heels, and they began to dig. The town of Ridgewater noticed the Stone Girls on their third day. Small towns always notice strangers, especially when those strangers are two young women with canvas work gloves and dirt under their fingernails buying supplies they cannot afford. Cora pushed through the door of Morrison's general store with a list she had written and rewritten until the paper was soft as cloth. Nails, timber for bracing, oil for the lamps, flour and salt pork and coffee, the essentials for surviving while you dug a hole that everyone would call madness. The store smelled like leather and tobacco, and the sawdust scattered across the wooden floor to soak up mud. 3 men stood near the counter, farmers by the look of them, their hands scarred by wire and work. They stopped talking when Cora entered, just stopped mid-sentence and stared. She was used to staring. She kept her eyes on the counter and her voice level when she asked the shopkeeper for what she needed. He was a thin man with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling size. He looked at her list and then at her, and then at the list again. He quoted her a price that was 15% higher than the marked costs on the shelf behind him. She saw him do the math. Saw him decide that orphan girls with no family and no protection were fair game for the kind of small theft that passes for business in places like this. Cora set her jaw and nodded. She had expected this. Had expected worse, honestly. She counted out the money slowly. making sure he saw exactly how much she had and how much she did not. Behind her, one of the farmers spoke. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who has never been told to lower it. He said something about the stone property. Said Henrik had been crazy as a loon those last few years. Said it was a shame the bank would take that land come spring when these girls could not pay the taxes. Another man laughed. Said maybe someone should marry one of them. Get the land that way. The laugh that followed was not kind. Cora's hands tightened on the counter, but she did not turn around. She had learned in foster homes that responding to cruelty only invited more of it. You swallowed it. You survived it. You remembered it for later. The shopkeeper wrapped her purchases in brown paper and twine. He did not meet her eyes when he handed them over. Guilt, maybe. Or just the uncomfortable knowledge that he was complicit in small evil and had chosen to be anyway. She was halfway to the door when a woman's voice stopped her, clear and cold as November water. The voice said her name, said it like a question and a judgment both. Cora turned. The woman standing near the fabric display was perhaps 58, maybe 60. Well-dressed in the way that signals status in small towns. Not wealthy, but comfortable. Her hair was pinned in a style that had been fashionable 10 years ago and had calcified into habit. Her face held the expression of someone who considers kindness a weakness. Margaret Hayes. Cora knew the name, though they had never met. The shopkeeper's wife had mentioned her yesterday. President of the Ladies' Auxiliary, head of the church social committee, the kind of woman who decided what was proper and who was acceptable, and which rules could be bent for the right people. Margaret looked Cora up and down with the thoroughness of a livestock assessment. She took in the work clothes, the calluses forming on Cora's palms, the dirt under her nails that no amount of scrubbing had managed to remove. She said it must be difficult. 2 young women, all alone, on that property. She said it with her mouth forming sympathy, but her eyes calculating something else entirely. Cora said they were managing. Margaret's smile did not reach her eyes. She said the Ladies' Auxiliary would be happy to help. Perhaps find them positions in town. Domestic work, maybe. Respectable employment for young women without family. Surely that would be preferable to trying to maintain a property they could not possibly manage alone. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Give up the land. Accept your place. Know that you are not capable of what you are attempting. Cora felt heat rise in her chest. The heat that had gotten her in trouble in 3 different foster homes. The heat that Violet called her flash fire and begged her to control. She opened her mouth to say something she would regret, and then she caught Margaret's expression. The woman wanted her to explode, wanted her to prove that she was exactly what Margaret had already decided she was, an uncontrolled, inappropriate girl who did not deserve respect or consideration. Cora swallowed the fire. She made her voice sweet as poisoned honey. She thanked Margaret for the kind offer. She said they were quite happy on their grandfather's land. She said they would certainly call on the Ladies' Auxiliary if they needed assistance. Margaret's smile tightened. She had been denied the satisfaction of watching Cora destroy herself, but then Cora made a mistake, a small one. The kind that seems insignificant until it is not. She turned to leave, and one of the farmers said something just loud enough to hear, something crude about what 2 young women alone might be willing to do for help with heavy work. The other men laughed. Cora spun back. The words came out before she could stop them. Sharp and cutting and exactly the wrong thing to say in a town where women were expected to absorb insult with gracious silence. She told them that men who could not dig a hole without commentary might not be men worth listening to in the first place. The laughter stopped. The temperature in the store dropped 10 degrees. Margaret's face went carefully blank in the way that meant she was filing this moment away for future use. Cora walked out with her supplies and the burning knowledge that she had just made everything harder. That her temper, her flaw, the thing Violet had begged her to control, had just cost them something they could not afford to lose. Community support, the benefit of the doubt, the small kindnesses that made survival possible in places like this. Behind her, through the window, she saw Margaret lean close to the shopkeeper and begin speaking, spreading the story, shaping it, turning Cora's moment of anger into evidence of everything Margaret wanted people to believe about the Stone Girls. That they were inappropriate, aggressive, unwomanly, the kind of people who did not belong in decent society. Cora walked faster. She did not let herself look back. Violet was waiting at the edge of town with Scout and the small wagon they had borrowed from a neighbor whose name Cora could not remember. Her sister took one look at her face and asked what happened. Nothing, Cora said, just the usual, but Violet knew her too well. She had spent 14 years learning to read Cora's moods, learning when to push and when to stay quiet. She stayed quiet now. They loaded the supplies in silence and began the walk back to the property. They were a mile out of town when the carpenter appeared. He came from a side path that led through a stand of pines, carrying lumber on one shoulder like it weighed nothing. He was perhaps 32, maybe 35, tall in the way that made doorways seem too small. His hands were scarred from years of work with tools that did not forgive mistakes. He stopped when he saw them, set down the lumber carefully, looked at Cora with eyes that held something she could not quite name. Not pity, not judgment. Something else. Recognition, maybe, the kind that comes from seeing yourself in someone else's struggle. He introduced himself. Silas Reed. Carpenter. His place was 3 miles north of theirs. He said it like it mattered. Like proximity meant something in this landscape of isolation. Cora nodded. She had heard the name. The shopkeeper's wife had mentioned him too. Said his wife died 2 winters ago. Said he had not been the same since. Silas looked at the wagon, at the timber and nails. He asked if they were building something. Cora hesitated. The journal was back at the cabin, hidden under the floorboards where she had decided to keep it. The tunnel was barely started, 3 feet into the hillside, not even deep enough to require bracing yet. But something about the way Silas asked the question made her think he actually wanted to know. Not to mock, not to judge, but because he understood that sometimes people build things that do not make sense to anyone watching. She told him about the shelter, not everything, not the hot spring or her grandfather's specific instructions, just that they were digging into the South Hill, creating a space that could hold animals through the winter, based on techniques her grandfather had learned in Norway. She waited for him to laugh, to tell her it was impossible, to join the chorus of men who seemed to think women could not understand dirt and stone and the physics of survival. Instead, Silas nodded slowly. He said his wife had died in the winter of 1887, the blizzard that came in January and stayed for 9 days. The one where the temperature dropped to 40 below and the wind was so strong it tore the roof off Johnson's barn. He had thought their cabin was solid enough, had thought the fireplace and the woodpile would be sufficient. He was wrong. She went outside to check on the chickens the second night, got turned around in the whiteout. He found her 20 feet from the door. Too late. His voice when he said it was flat, emptied of emotion through repetition. This was a story he had told before. To himself, probably. In the dark hours when grief became an accounting of failures. Silas looked at Cora directly. He said if her grandfather knew something about surviving Montana winters that he did not know, then she should listen to him. He said the Scandinavians understood cold in a way that Americans did not, that they had centuries of knowledge about living in places where winter was a season that actively tried to murder you. He said he wished he had known what Henrik Stone knew, said maybe then Eliza would still be alive. Cora felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, just enough to let her speak without the defensive edge that had marked every conversation since they arrived. She asked if he knew how to brace a tunnel entrance. She did not have experience with load-bearing structures. Her grandfather's journal had diagrams, but she was working from drawings, not knowledge. Silas considered this. He said he could look at it. Not today. He had a job finishing a barn 5 miles east. But tomorrow, maybe, if she wanted. The offer hung in the air between them. Cora knew what accepting it would mean, that she needed help, that she could not do this alone, that her pride was less important than survival. She swallowed and nodded. Tomorrow, then. Silas picked up his lumber. Before he left, he said one more thing. Said it casual, like it did not matter, like it was not the first kind thing anyone in this town had offered without expecting something in return. He said his wife used to tell him that stubbornness was just courage that had not learned to ask for help yet. Then he walked away through the pines, leaving Cora standing in the road with something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, by lamplight, Cora read through her grandfather's journal again. She had been through it twice already, but each time she found new details, new layers of knowledge compressed into diagrams and notes. On page 47, she found a drawing of a ventilation system, 2 shafts, one for intake, one for exhaust. The physics of it made sense once she understood what Henrik was trying to achieve. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. If you position the shafts correctly, the temperature difference creates circulation without any mechanical assistance. The earth breathes for you. Elegant, beautiful. The kind of solution that seems obvious only after someone else shows you the pattern. Violet sat across from her, mending a shirt by the light of the second lamp. Scout lay between them, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. The dog had not left Violet's side since they arrived, had attached himself to her with the totality of animal devotion. Sometimes Cora wondered if Scout saw something of Henrik in Violet, some echo of the man who had fed him and walked with him and loved him for 12 years. Or maybe the dog just understood that Violet was the one who would let him grieve without demanding he move on. Violet broke the silence, asked if Cora trusted the carpenter. Silas. Cora looked up. She had been thinking about that question herself. Trust was not something she gave easily. Trust was what you offered to foster parents who promised kindness and delivered cruelty. Trust was what you extended to caseworkers who swore they would keep you and your sister together and then split you up anyway. Trust was the thing that had been broken so many times she had started to believe it could not be repaired. But there was something in the way Silas had talked about his wife. Something in the flatness of his voice when he recounted her death. Grief that deep did not lie. Pain that honest could not be performed. She told Violet she thought so, Thought he understood loss in a way that made him careful with other people's hope. Violet nodded. She tied off her thread and bit it clean. Said she liked that he had not laughed, that he had not treated them like children or fools or burdens, that he had offered help without making it feel like charity. Then she asked the question Cora had been avoiding. Asked what happened in town. What Margaret Hayes had said to make Cora's hands shake when she came back. Cora set the journal down. She was tired of lying to Violet. Tired of pretending that every interaction was not a small battle she was barely winning. She told her sister about Margaret's offer, about the implication that they should give up the land and accept their place as hired help in someone else's house. She told her about the farmers and their crude comments, about her own response, about the mistake she had made by letting her temper speak when silence would have been smarter. Violet listened without interruption. When Cora finished, her sister said something that surprised her, said that sometimes the smart thing and the right thing were different. That letting men talk about you like you were livestock might be safe, but it also taught them that you would accept it, that there was a cost to silence too. Cora looked at her 14-year-old sister and realized that Violet was not as soft as she pretended to be, that beneath the gentleness was something steel strong, something that had survived foster homes and loss and the particular cruelty of being a child no one wanted. Violet had just learned to hide her strength under kindness, had learned that people underestimated gentle things, and that being underestimated was its own kind of power. Maybe that was the smarter way, but Cora did not know how to be anything other than what she was. Fire and pride and the stubborn refusal to pretend she was less than she was just to make other people comfortable. They went to bed without resolving it. But the next morning, when Silas Reed appeared at the tunnel entrance with better timber than they could afford and tools they did not own, Cora swallowed her pride and accepted his help. He looked at what they had done. 3 feet into the hillside. Clay so thick it had to be pried out in chunks. The entrance braced with wood that was already starting to bow under the weight of earth above it. He did not say it was wrong, did not criticize, just set down his tools and began reinforcing the frame with the quiet competence of someone who had spent decades making sure structures did not collapse and kill the people inside them. They worked in silence for the first hour. Cora and Violet digging, Silas bracing, Scout watching from his position at the tunnel mouth like a sentry. Then Silas asked a question. Asked if they had considered the water table. Asked if Henrik's journal mentioned anything about drainage. Cora stopped digging. She had not thought about drainage, had been so focused on reaching 12 feet that she had not considered what would happen when they broke through to the hot spring. Water underground moved. If they punctured an aquifer without a plan for channeling it, they could flood the whole structure. She felt panic rise in her throat. Another thing she did not know. Another way she could fail. Silas must have seen it in her face. He said it was not a problem. Said there were ways to manage it. Gravel beds, drainage channels, simple solutions that worked if you planned for them. He said it like it was obvious, like he had confidence in her ability to learn, like failure was not inevitable just because she was 17 and female and learning as she went. Cora felt something shift, just slightly, just enough. She pulled out Henrik's journal and showed Silas the full design. The ventilation system, the temperature calculations, the notes about the hot spring, and its consistent 58-degree output. Everything her grandfather had planned. Silas studied it with the attention of someone reading scripture. He traced the lines with one scarred finger, asked questions about measurements and angles and load distribution. He understood what Henrik had been attempting, saw the elegance of it, When he looked up, his expression held something close to reverence. He said this was not the work of a crazy man. This was engineering, real engineering. The kind that had kept people alive for generations in places where survival was not guaranteed. He said if they built this right, if they followed Henrik's design exactly, it would work. He would stake his professional reputation on it. Cora felt tears sting her eyes and blinked them away furiously. She had not realized how much she needed someone to believe her, to look at what she was attempting and not see madness, to understand that this was not foolishness, but necessity. The difference between surviving winter and becoming another statistic in the catalog of people Montana killed. Silas worked with them until sunset. When he left, he did not ask for payment, did not expect gratitude beyond the simple thank you Cora managed to force through her tight throat. He just said he would come back tomorrow. Bring more timber. Help them shore up the entrance properly before they went deeper. He said one more thing before he disappeared into the pines, said his wife Eliza would have liked them, would have admired what they were doing, would have been the first one helping dig if she were still alive. That night, Violet sang while she cooked their meager dinner. Old songs in Norwegian that Henrik must have taught their mother. Songs about long winters and the spring that always came after. Her voice was thin but true. It filled the cabin with something that almost felt like hope. Cora sat at the table with a journal open, planning the next phase. 5 feet down now, 7 more to go. The clay was getting harder. The work was getting slower. But they had help now. They had someone who believed them. Outside, the temperature dropped. The aspens were almost bare. The geese had finished their migration south. Every wild thing that understood Montana was ready for what was coming. Cora and Violet Stone were learning to dig, learning to trust, learning that sometimes survival required accepting help from strangers who understood loss. Learning that pride was less important than living through winter. They did not know yet about the collapse that was coming. Did not know that Margaret Hayes had been spreading stories through town about the inappropriate stone girls and their tunnel to nowhere. Did not know that in 3 weeks the earth would betray them and test whether they had learned enough to survive it. But they were digging, and that was enough for now. The collapse came on a Tuesday in October when the aspens were bare and the morning frost no longer melted by noon. It came without warning, which is how the worst things always come. Cora was 12 feet into the hillside when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of sound. The particular silence that comes right before the world breaks. She had just enough time to understand what was happening before the timber support gave way. Before tons of clay and stone and earth that had been patient for millions of years suddenly decided it was tired of being held back. The last thing she saw was lamplight. Then darkness swallowed everything. Above ground, Violet was dumping a wheelbarrow of excavated clay onto the growing pile when she heard the sound. Like thunder, but wrong. Too close, too final. She dropped the wheelbarrow handles and ran. Scout was already at the tunnel entrance, pawing frantically at the collapsed opening, whining in a pitch that made Violet's chest constrict with terror. The entrance had caved in, completely. Where there had been a carefully braced opening supported by Silas Reed's expert timber work, there was now just a wall of collapsed earth and broken wood. And somewhere behind that wall was Cora. Violet did not scream, did not waste breath on panic. She grabbed the shovel Cora had left propped against the hillside and started digging. Her hands shook so hard she could barely grip the handle, but she forced them steady. forced herself to breathe, forced herself to think. Cora was alive. Had to be alive. The tunnel was deep enough now that the collapse would not have reached all the way back. There would be an air pocket. There would be time. She just had to dig fast enough. Scout dug beside her with his front paws, throwing dirt backward in desperate bursts. His claws scraped against stone. His breath came in panicked gasps. But he did not stop. Did not give up. 14 years of loyalty concentrated into this single moment of need. Violet dug for 20 minutes before she accepted she could not do this alone. The collapsed section was 6 feet deep at least, maybe more. Clay packed so tight it might as well have been concrete. Her 14-year-old arms were already shaking with exhaustion. Her hands were bleeding where blisters had formed and torn. She looked at Scout. The dog looked back with brown eyes that held too much understanding. He knew what she was thinking, knew she had to leave, had to get help, had to trust that Cora could survive a little longer. Violet ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Down the hill, across the creek, through the stand of pines where Silas Reed had said his place was 3 miles north. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they would collapse. She ran because Cora had spent 13 years being the one who ran toward danger to protect her. And now it was Violet's turn. She found Silas in his workshop, planing a board that would become part of someone's floor. He looked up when she burst through the door, took one look at her face, white with terror, streaked with dirt and tears she had not realized she was crying, and set down his tools. He did not ask questions, did not waste time on explanations. He grabbed a shovel and a coil of rope and followed her back the way she had come. His longer legs ate up the distance. Violet struggled to keep pace. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her vision started to narrow at the edges. Silas told her to breathe, told her they would reach Cora in time, told her with the certainty of someone who needed to believe it as much as she did. They made it back in 12 minutes. Silas assessed the collapse with the speed of someone who had dealt with structural failures before. He calculated weight distribution and collapse patterns and the most likely location of air pockets. Then he started digging. His shovel bit through clay like it was loose soil. His arms moved with mechanical efficiency. No wasted motion, no panic. Just the steady rhythm of someone doing the only thing that mattered. Violet dug beside him. Her hands screamed with pain. Blood made the shovel handle slippery. She did not care. She dug until Silas gently moved her aside and took over her section too. Told her to rest. Told her she had done enough. She had not done enough. Would not have done enough until Cora was breathing air again. 2 hours passed. Then 3. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped. Silas dug without stopping. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. His breathing came harder, but his rhythm never faltered. Violet knelt beside Scout and prayed to a god she was not sure she believed in. Prayed that Cora's stubbornness would keep her alive. Prayed that air was finding its way through cracks in the collapse. Prayed that they were digging in the right place. Then Silas's shovel hit something that was not dirt. He dropped to his knees and started pulling away clay with his bare hands. Violet saw it the same moment he did. Wood. The broken remains of a support timber. And beyond it, a gap. Small. Dark. But there. Silas called Cora's name into that darkness. Once. Twice. 3 times. No response. He widened the gap, ripped away more earth, made the opening large enough for a body. Then he looked at Violet, and his face held an expression she could not read. Something between hope and dread. He went in, disappeared into that narrow tunnel of collapsed earth and broken timber. Violet held her breath, counted seconds, got to 47 before she heard his voice, muffled but unmistakable. He had found her. It took another hour to extract Cora from the collapsed tunnel. An hour of careful digging and bracing and praying the whole thing did not come down again. When Silas finally emerged, carrying Cora in his arms like she weighed nothing, Violet felt something in her chest crack open. Cora was unconscious, covered in clay dust. Her left shoulder was bleeding where a falling timber had struck her. But she was breathing. Her chest rose and fell with beautiful, regular rhythm. Silas laid her gently on the grass. Violet dropped to her knees beside her sister and took her hand. The hand was cold. Cora's face was pale beneath the dirt. But she was alive. Alive. The word repeated in Violet's mind like a prayer answered. Cora's eyes opened, unfocused at first. Then they found Violet's face, and something like recognition flickered through them. Her lips moved. Violet leaned close to hear. Cora whispered something that sounded like, "Keep digging." Then she passed out again. They carried her to the cabin. Silas made a splint for her shoulder while Violet heated water and found clean cloth for bandages. The wound was deep. It would leave a scar. A permanent reminder that the earth did not care about determination or need, or the desperate hopes of orphan girls. The earth just was, neutral, indifferent. You learned its rules, or you died. Silas stayed until Cora woke again, until she could drink water and prove she was not concussed beyond function. Then he stood to leave. Violet thanked him with words that felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for saving the only family you have left? Silas said he did not need thanks. Said he should have checked the bracing more carefully. Should have anticipated the clay's weight distribution. Should have known better. Violet saw the guilt in his face and understood it was not really about Cora. It was about Eliza. About failing to save his wife 2 years ago. About getting a second chance to keep someone alive and the terror of almost failing again. She told him it was not his fault. The tunnel was Cora's plan. Her risk. Her choice. He had helped, but he was not responsible for protecting them from their own stubbornness. Silas nodded, but Violet could see he did not believe it. Some guilt lives too deep to be reasoned with. After he left, Violet sat beside Cora's bed and watched her sister sleep. Scout lay on the floor beside them, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. The dog had not eaten all day, had barely drunk water, had spent 3 hours digging and then watching and waiting with the patience of something that understood grief. Violet reached down and scratched behind his ears. Scout's eyes opened and met hers. In that moment, she understood why Henrik had named him Scout. He was the one who went ahead, the one who checked for danger, the one who stood watch while others slept. He had been doing it for Henrik for 12 years. Now he was doing it for them. Cora slept through the night and into the next morning. When she finally woke, the first thing she did was try to sit up. Pain lanced through her shoulder and she gasped, falling back against the pillow. Violet pushed her down gently, told her to stay still. The wound needed time to close. Moving would tear it open again. Cora asked how long she had been buried, Her voice was rough from breathing dust. 3 hours, Violet said. 3 hours of not knowing if her sister was alive or dead. 3 hours of digging and praying and learning what it felt like to be the one left behind. Cora's eyes filled with tears. She said she was sorry. Sorry for being reckless. Sorry for not checking the supports more carefully. Sorry for making Violet dig her out. Violet told her to stop. Told her they were partners in this. Told her that saving each other was what family meant. That Cora had been doing it for 13 years, and it was about time Violet got a turn. Cora laughed, then winced because laughing hurt her shoulder. She asked about the tunnel. How bad was the collapse? Bad, Violet admitted. The entrance was completely blocked. 6 feet of collapsed earth. The timber supports were shattered. They would have to start over. Reinforce everything. Figure out what went wrong and fix it before they went deeper. Cora was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked for Henrik's journal. Violet retrieved it from under the floorboards where Cora had been hiding it. Cora opened it with her right hand, her left arm useless in its splint. She found the page about structural integrity. Read it slowly. Then she found what she was looking for. A note in the margin, written in Henrik's careful hand. Weight of clay increases exponentially with depth. Double all support calculations below 8 feet. Cora had been at 12 feet when the collapse happened. She had been following Henrik's original calculations. Had not seen this margin note. Had not doubled the supports. She had made a mistake. An honest one. The kind that comes from learning something difficult with no teacher except a dead man's journal. But in construction, honest mistakes still killed you. She looked at Violet. Her face was pale. Her eyes held something Violet had never seen before. Fear, maybe. Or the understanding that stubbornness alone was not enough to survive. That you needed knowledge and humility and the willingness to admit when you were wrong. Cora said they should stop. Said the tunnel was too dangerous. Said she could not ask Violet to risk dying because of her mistakes. Violet stared at her sister. Then she said no. Said they were not stopping. Said their grandfather had not left them this knowledge so they could give up the first time something went wrong. Said the tunnel had collapsed because they had not been careful enough, so they would be more careful. They would learn. They would do it right. She said it with the steel that lived beneath her softness. The strength Cora sometimes forgot Violet possessed. Cora looked at her 14-year-old sister and saw herself reflected back. Stubborn. Determined. Unwilling to accept that some things were impossible just because they were hard. She nodded. They would keep digging. But first, she needed to heal. Needed her shoulder to close enough that she could swing a pickaxe without tearing it open. Needed time to study Henrik's journal more carefully. To find all the margin notes and corrections she had missed. 2 weeks passed. October bled into November. The temperature dropped steadily. Frost stayed on the ground all day now. The creek developed ice along its edges. Snow fell twice, light dustings that melted by afternoon, but carried a warning. Winter was coming. The real winter. The kind that killed. During those 2 weeks, Violet worked on the tunnel alone, not digging deeper. They could not afford another collapse, but clearing the debris, salvaging what timber could be reused, preparing for when Cora could help again. Silas came every few days, brought food his neighbors had given him to pass along, brought medicine for Cora's shoulder, brought his knowledge and his careful hands and his guilt-driven need to make sure they survived. He never stayed long, never imposed, just helped where help was needed and then disappeared back into the pines. But his presence was steady, reliable, the kind of support you could build something on. On the 18th day after the collapse, Cora declared herself healed enough to work. Her shoulder still ached. The scar tissue was still pink and tender, but she could grip a shovel, could swing it without the wound tearing open. That was enough. They started over. This time, they followed Henrik's instructions exactly. Double supports below 8 feet, triple bracing at the entrance, drainage channels dug before they went deep enough to hit water. Everything measured twice. Everything checked and rechecked. The work was slower now, more careful. They lost the frantic urgency that had driven them before the collapse, replaced it with patience, with attention to detail, with the understanding that surviving required more than determination. It required wisdom. By the end of November, they reached 10 feet. The clay was harder here, colder, more resistant to the shovel. Cora's hands bled regularly despite the calluses. Violet's back ached from pushing the wheelbarrow. Scout's old joints creaked from lying on the cold ground while he watched them work. But they were close now, close to 12 feet. Close to the hot spring Henrik swore was waiting. Close to the warmth that would mean survival, or the emptiness that would mean they had dug their grave exactly as everyone predicted. Then, on a Tuesday that tasted like snow, Cora's shovel broke through into something that was not clay. She stopped, called for Violet. Together they cleared away more earth. Carefully, gently, revealing a pocket in the rock where moisture glistened. Cora pressed her hand against the wall, held it there, waited. Warmth. Definite warmth. Not dramatic, not hot. Just a gentle, steady heat that had nothing to do with the November cold above them. Violet pressed her hand beside Cora's. Her eyes went wide. Then tears started falling and she could not stop them. Relief and grief and the overwhelming understanding that their grandfather had not been crazy, had not been lying, had left them exactly what he promised, a way to survive. Cora pulled the thermometer from her pocket, the one she had bought in town and carried every day since the collapse. She hung it on a nail she had hammered into the wall for exactly this purpose. They stood in the lamplight and watched the mercury climb. 54 degrees, 55, 56. It held at 56, steady, unchanging, while the world above them was 38 degrees and dropping. Violet started laughing through her tears. Started laughing because they had done it. They had dug 12 feet into a Montana hillside in November and found exactly what a dead man's journal promised they would find. Warmth. Hidden warmth that the earth kept secret from everyone except those stubborn enough to dig for it. Cora sank to her knees in the clay dirt floor of the tunnel and put her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. Violet knelt beside her and wrapped her arms around her sister, and they stayed like that for a long time. 2 orphan girls in a hole in the ground, crying because hope was not as dangerous as they had believed. Scout pressed against them both, his old body warm, his breathing steady, a reminder that they were not alone, that loyalty existed, that some promises were kept even after death. That night, by lamplight, Cora wrote in the margins of Henrik's journal, wrote about the collapse and the lessons learned, wrote about the warmth at 12 feet, wrote about Violet's courage and Silas's kindness and Scout's unwavering presence. She wrote, "We found it, grandfather. Just like you said, the earth kept its promise. Now we need to keep ours." Outside, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees. Inside the cabin, Scout slept by the fire. Violet sang softly while she mended clothes. And Cora planned the next phase, expanding the chamber, creating enough space for 3 horses and 2 girls and a dog. Building the ventilation system Henrik had designed, finishing before December, before the real cold came, before the blizzard everyone whispered about in town, the kind that came every 10 years or so and killed everything that was not prepared. They had found the warmth. Now they had to build the shelter that would let them survive what was coming. In town, Margaret Hayes continued spreading her stories. Stories about inappropriate girls and their tunnel to nowhere. Stories about how the collapse should have been a sign. Stories designed to isolate and diminish and prove that some people were not meant to rise above their station. But Margaret did not know about the hot spring, did not know about the 56-degree warmth or the shelter taking shape beneath the hill, did not know that her stories were about to be proven so catastrophically wrong that she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget she ever told them. December was coming. The blizzard was coming. And when it arrived, 14 people would stand outside a tunnel door in the killing cold and beg to be let inside. And Cora Stone would have to decide whether salvation was something you earned or something you gave freely to people who had called you a fool. But that was still weeks away. Tonight, they had warmth. They had hope. They had each other. And in Montana, in November, when winter was gathering its strength for the killing blow, that was more than most people had. It was enough to keep digging. The knocking brought Cora back to the present, back to the cold iron bar beneath her palm, back to the desperate voices outside and the choice that would define everything that came after. Her hand moved. The bar slid free. Wood groaned against wood. And then the door swung inward, and 14 people stumbled through like survivors of a shipwreck washing ashore. Silas Reed carried his 6-year-old daughter Clara in his arms. The girl's face blue-white with cold, her small body shaking so violently it looked like convulsions. Behind him came Margaret Hayes, supporting her husband whose left hand was blackened with frostbite. Then Ruth Mercer, the elderly neighbor who had left flowers on their doorstep 3 months ago. Then Caleb Morgan, the banker who had tried to steal their land, his expensive coat doing nothing against cold that did not care about money. 11 more followed. Farmers and their wives, the shopkeeper from Morrison's general store, a widow Cora had seen at church. All of them half frozen, all of them desperate, all of them flooding into the tunnel that they had called a grave. The last person through was a teenage boy Cora recognized from town. He had been one of the ones laughing that day at Morrison's, one of the ones who made crude comments about what 2 girls alone might be willing to do. Now he stumbled past her without meeting her eyes, his face marked with shame and frostbite both. Cora barred the door behind them. The wind cut off like a blade. The temperature inside the tunnel was 56 degrees. Outside, it had dropped to 43 below zero. The difference between those 2 numbers was the difference between living and dying. The 14 people collapsed against the tunnel walls. Some were crying. Some were silent with shock. All of them were looking at Cora and Violet like they were seeing ghosts or angels, something impossible that had somehow become real. Silas set his daughter down gently near the horses. The animals shifted but did not panic. They had been in the tunnel for 6 days now, adjusting to the confined space and the steady warmth. Scout moved among the newcomers, sniffing each one methodically, his tail wagging slowly. The dog understood. More pack, more family, more to protect. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were breathing and the occasional whimper of pain as frozen extremities began to thaw. Cora stood with her back to the door and studied the people who had invaded her shelter, the people who had mocked her, doubted her, tried to steal from her. The people who were alive right now only because she had opened a door she had every right to keep closed. Margaret Hayes was the first to break the silence. She looked at Cora with eyes that held something between disbelief and devastation. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She said she was sorry, said she had been wrong, said things that came too late to matter and too quietly to change anything. But she said them anyway, there in the lamplight, with her husband's ruined hand cradled in her lap. Cora did not respond. She moved past Margaret to where Silas knelt beside his daughter. The girl was still shaking. Her lips were still blue. Cora had seen hypothermia before, in a foster home where the heat got shut off in January. She knew what came next if they did not act fast. She told Violet to bring blankets, told Silas to get Clara's wet clothes off. The body could not warm itself if the cold was pressed directly against the skin. Violet moved quickly, pulling their spare quilts from the corner where they had stored them. Together, they wrapped Clara in layers of fabric and warmth. The girl's shaking slowly subsided. Her breathing steadied. Color began returning to her cheeks. Silas watched his daughter with an expression that would have broken Cora's heart if she had not spent 13 years learning to protect it. A gratitude and guilt and relief all mixed together. The look of a father who had almost lost his child and knew exactly whose choices had saved her. The other survivors began to settle. They spread out as much as the confined space allowed. 16 people and 3 horses and 1 old dog in a chamber that Henrik Stone had designed for exactly this purpose, for survival when the world above became uninhabitable. Cora moved among them, assessing injuries. Most had frostbite on their fingers and toes. Several had the glassy-eyed look of severe hypothermia. One man had a gash on his forehead where falling ice had struck him, but they were alive. They would stay alive as long as the tunnel held and the warmth lasted. Hours passed. The survivors ate the food Violet offered, dried meat and hardtack and the last of their potatoes. It was not much, but it was warm and it was food, and that was more than any of them had expected to have. They drank melted snow that Cora heated over the small fire they had built in the ventilation shaft. Henrik's design pulled the smoke up and out, leaving the air clear and breathable. As the shock wore off and warmth returned to their bodies, the survivors began to talk. Quietly at first, then with more urgency. They told their stories. How the blizzard had come suddenly, without the warning the old-timers swore always preceded the big storms. How the temperature had dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours. How the wind had been strong enough to tear roofs off barns and blow cattle off their feet. The shopkeeper said he had seen 3 people freeze to death in the street. They had been trying to reach their homes, had gotten disoriented in the whiteout, had collapsed within sight of their own doors, and died before anyone could reach them. The widow said her cabin had started to collapse under the weight of the snow. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back, had wandered in the storm for what felt like hours before stumbling onto Silas and his daughter. They had banded together, following the vague memory of where the stone property was, following the desperate hope that the tunnel they had all laughed at might actually exist. Caleb Morgan sat apart from the others. His face was gray, his breathing labored. He had not spoken since entering the tunnel, had not met Cora's eyes, had not acknowledged that he was alive because of the girls whose land he had tried to steal. On the 7th day in the tunnel, Ruth Mercer came to Cora. The old woman moved stiffly, her joints protesting the cold and confinement. She sat down beside Cora with the careful deliberation of someone who had something difficult to say and was gathering courage. She said she owed Cora the truth, the whole truth, not just about the flowers and the clean cabin, but about Henrik and Caleb and the real reason a good man had died alone. Cora set down the rope she had been mending and waited. She had suspected there was more to the story, had seen the way Ruth looked at Caleb, the way she avoided being near him even in the confined space of the tunnel. Ruth's hands shook as she spoke. She said that 20 years ago, Caleb had discovered something about the land beneath this valley, something about geothermal deposits that could be worth a fortune if sold to the right mining company. He had started buying up properties, offering good prices to farmers who did not know what they were selling. Henrik had refused, had told Caleb that the land was not about money, that it held knowledge more valuable than gold, that it would save lives when the time came. Caleb had not accepted that refusal. He had threatened Ruth, who owned the property adjacent to Henrik's, had told her that if she did not convince the old Norwegian to sell, he would make sure she lost her farm to unpaid debts. Ruth had been a widow, had no family, had been terrified, but Henrik had been stubborn, so Caleb had changed tactics. He had befriended Henrik, had brought him gifts, including a bottle of whiskey that he said came from a friend in Denver. Ruth's voice broke. She said she had seen Caleb mixing something into that whiskey, something powdery and white that dissolved quickly. She had known then what he was doing. Arsenic poisoning. Slow enough that it looked like natural decline. Fast enough that Henrik would be dead within months. She had said nothing, had been too afraid, had watched Henrik weaken and fade and finally die while she kept her silence and hated herself for it. After he died, she had cleaned the cabin, had prepared it for the granddaughter she knew would come eventually, had left flowers as a pathetic apology to a dead man who deserved so much more than her cowardice. When Ruth finished, her face was wet with tears. She said she did not deserve to be in this tunnel, did not deserve the warmth or the safety or Cora's mercy. She said she was sorry, said it over and over until the words lost meaning. Cora looked at this old woman who had let her grandfather die, who had cleaned a cabin as penance, who had carried 20 years of guilt and was finally brave enough to confess it. She felt anger, hot and righteous and entirely justified, felt the urge to scream at Ruth, to throw her out of the tunnel and let the cold take her the way it should have taken her years ago. But then she looked at Violet. Her sister sat across the chamber, Clara asleep with her head in Violet's lap. Scout pressed against them both. Violet's eyes met Cora's, and she saw understanding there, saw her sister silently asking her to be better than the anger, to be bigger than the hurt. Cora turned back to Ruth. She said she could not forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she understood that fear made people into cowards. That guilt was its own kind of prison. That Ruth had spent 20 years punishing herself more thoroughly than Cora ever could. She said Ruth could stay in the tunnel, could survive this blizzard, could live to make whatever amends were possible to make. But after the storm passed, Ruth would have to stand up in front of everyone and tell the truth. About Caleb, about Henrik, about everything. Ruth nodded, said she would, said she should have done it years ago. Across the chamber, Caleb Morgan had been listening. His face had gone from gray to white. He stood abruptly, swaying slightly. Everyone turned to look at him. He said Ruth was lying, said she was a crazy old woman trying to cause trouble, said there was no evidence, no proof, just the delusions of someone who had lived alone too long. Ruth reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small glass vial, half full of white powder, said she had taken it from his house before fleeing the storm, said she had carried it for 3 years, waiting for the courage to use it. Caleb stared at the vial. His mouth opened and closed. No words came out. The truth was there in his face, in the panic in his eyes, in the way his hands shook. Silas stood. So did 2 of the farmers. They moved toward Caleb with expressions that promised justice, not gentle justice, not legal justice, the kind of justice that happened in tunnels where no one could see. Cora stepped between them and Caleb. She said no. Said they were not doing this here. Said violence in this space would poison the warmth that was keeping them all alive. The men stopped, looked at her with frustration and respect both. She was 17 years old, but she stood like someone who had earned authority through surviving things they could not imagine. She told them that Caleb would face consequences, that Ruth's testimony and the vial would be enough to see him tried and convicted, but not here, not now, not while they were all still trapped together in a hole in the ground, dependent on each other for survival. The men backed down. Caleb sank to the floor and put his face in his hands. Whether it was shame or fear or the understanding that his life as he knew it was over, Cora could not tell, did not care. On the 8th day, Caleb Morgan died. He had been sick since the 7th day, running a fever despite the constant temperature, his breathing becoming labored. The hypothermia he had suffered before entering the tunnel had weakened him more than anyone realized. His body, stressed by cold and guilt and the sudden exposure of his crimes, simply gave up. The shopkeeper, who had some medical training, said it was his heart, said the cold had damaged it, said there was nothing anyone could have done. But Cora wondered if guilt could kill you, if carrying the weight of murder for 3 years could damage something inside you that no doctor could heal, if poetic justice was real, or if sometimes the universe just got tired of waiting for people to face consequences. They could not bury him. The ground outside was frozen solid, so they wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in the coldest corner of the tunnel, as far from the hot spring as possible. They would deal with his body when the storm passed. For now, he was just another weight they had to carry. On the 9th day, the wind stopped. The silence woke Cora from uneasy sleep. She had become so accustomed to the constant howl that its absence felt like a held breath, like the world waiting to see what would happen next. She climbed the sloping entrance passage and put her ear against the door. Nothing, no wind, no sound at all. She lifted the bar, pushed. The door opened 6 inches before hitting resistance. Snow, packed against the entrance by days of wind. She pushed harder. The door opened another foot, enough to see outside. The world was white, completely white. Snow covered everything to a depth she could not measure. The trees were buried to their middle branches. The barn was gone, collapsed under the weight. The fence posts had disappeared entirely, but the sky was blue, perfectly, impossibly blue. The kind of blue that came after storms, when the air was so clean, it looked like you could see through it, to space. The blizzard had ended. They had survived. Cora turned back to the tunnel, to the 14 people who were stirring now, waking to the silence, to Violet and Scout and the 3 horses who had kept them company through 9 days of confinement, to Silas and his daughter, to Margaret and her husband, to Ruth with her 20 years of guilt finally confessed, to the body of Caleb Morgan wrapped in a blanket in the corner. She said they could go home now. The storm was over. They had survived. But home was different now. Everything was different. 14 people knew the truth about what the Stone sisters had built, about what Henrik had known, about what Caleb had done. That knowledge would spread, would change Ridgewater, would change how people understood survival and stubbornness and the wisdom of trusting what others called madness. Margaret Hayes was the last to leave. She stood at the entrance, looking back at Cora with eyes that held something too complicated to name. She said she had sabotaged the timber supports back in October, had been the reason the tunnel collapsed, had almost killed Cora through her fear and her cruelty. She said she did not expect forgiveness, just wanted Cora to know. Wanted the truth spoken before it could fester. Cora looked at this woman who had tried to destroy her, who had almost succeeded, who was alive now only because Cora had chosen mercy over justice. She said she knew, had figured it out weeks ago when she studied the break patterns in the timber. Margaret had done a poor job of sabotage, had not understood load-bearing structures well enough to make it look like an accident. Margaret's face crumpled. She asked why Cora had opened the door, why she had saved people who tried to hurt her. Cora said it was because her grandfather had taught her something Margaret did not understand, that the earth gave warmth to everyone who sought it, did not ask if they deserved it, did not check their history or their intentions, just provided, constant and indifferent and more merciful than any person. She said she was trying to be like the earth. It was harder than she expected. Margaret left without another word. But Cora saw her pause at the top of the hill, saw her turn back to look at the tunnel entrance, saw something in the woman's posture that might have been shame or might have been the beginning of change. The tunnel stood empty now except for Cora and Violet and Scout and the horses. The bodies would come later. They would learn that 23 people had died in Granite County, 67 across the 4-county region. People who had not prepared, who had not believed that winter could be this cruel, who had trusted that their cabins and fireplaces would be enough. But that was later. Right now, in this moment, Cora stood in the warm chamber 12 feet underground and felt something she had not felt since she was 4 years old. And her grandfather had been alive, and her parents had not yet died. Safe, she felt safe, and that was worth more than revenge, worth more than proving people wrong, worth more than anything except the sister standing beside her and the old dog pressed against their legs, and the knowledge that sometimes, if you dig deep enough, you find exactly what you need to survive. The world outside the tunnel was a graveyard dressed in white. Cora stood on the hillside 3 days after the blizzard ended and counted the losses. The barn was a pile of broken timber buried under 6 feet of snow. The chicken coop had vanished completely. 2 fence lines had collapsed, but the cabin still stood, damaged, with one wall partially caved and the roof sagging dangerously, but it had survived. The tunnel had saved more than lives. It had saved the idea that survival was possible if you had the right knowledge and the stubbornness to use it. People came to see it. At first, just the families who had sheltered inside, bringing neighbors to show them the impossible thing that had kept them alive. Then, farmers from adjacent counties who had lost livestock. Then, a professor from the Montana Agricultural College in Bozeman who traveled 2 days through snow to document it. The professor spent 6 hours in the tunnel, measuring everything: the depth, the entrance angle, the ventilation system, the temperature differential. He filled an entire notebook with diagrams and calculations. When he emerged, he looked at Cora with something close to reverence. He said this was engineering of the highest caliber, the kind that came from centuries of survival knowledge distilled into pure function. He asked if he could write a paper about it, could cite Henrik Stone as the designer, could help spread this knowledge to other communities facing Montana winters. Cora said yes, but only if the paper included instructions detailed enough that any farmer with basic tools could replicate it. Knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. The professor agreed. Within 2 years, 43 geothermal shelters would be built across Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming. Within 5 years, 200. Everyone tracing its lineage back to a Norwegian immigrant who died alone, but left behind something more permanent than children. Margaret Hayes came to the farm on a gray afternoon in January. She came alone, without her husband, without the armor of her social position. She stood at the door and asked if she could speak with Cora. She said she wanted to help rebuild the cabin, said she had no carpentry skills but could cook for workers, could bring supplies, could do whatever Cora needed that did not require trust or forgiveness. Cora studied the woman who had sabotaged her tunnel, who had spread rumors designed to destroy. She looked for deception and found only exhaustion. She asked Margaret why. Why sabotage the tunnel? Why try so hard to make them fail? Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. She said she had been afraid that if 2 orphan girls with nothing could succeed through knowledge and work, what did that say about women like her? Women who had built their entire identity around being proper, being acceptable, being what men expected. If Cora could dig a tunnel and survive a blizzard and prove that women did not need protection, just knowledge, then Margaret's whole life had been a lie. So she had tried to make Cora fail, tried to prove the old ways were right. The tunnel had proven her wrong. And Margaret had spent 9 days in that warm chamber, understanding that her fear had almost killed her. She said she did not expect forgiveness, but she wanted to help. Wanted her daughter to see her mother choose differently than fear. Cora was quiet. She thought about her own mistakes, her temper, her pride, how stubbornness could be strength or blindness depending on how you wielded it. She said Margaret could help, could spread truth as aggressively as she had spread lies, could teach other women that proper and safe were not the same thing. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She nodded once, sharp and decisive. The next day she returned with bread and stew, and an apology she delivered to Silas Reed so he would know the collapse had not been his fault. Over the next months, Margaret Hayes became a different kind of force in Ridgewater. She organized women to help rebuild every structure damaged by the blizzard. She stood up in church and told the story of the tunnel, of how 2 girls she had tried to destroy had saved her life. Some people forgave her, some never would. But everyone understood that Margaret Hayes had changed. Ruth Mercer kept her promise. At the first town meeting after the storm, she stood in front of everyone and told the truth about Caleb Morgan, about the arsenic, about Henrik Stone's murder, about her 20 years of cowardice. She presented the vial as evidence, testified to everything she had seen, everything she should have reported decades ago. Caleb's body was buried in the town cemetery, far from where respectable people were laid to rest. His headstone bore only his name and dates, just the facts of his existence and the empty space where redemption should have been. Ruth lived another 7 years at the Stone farm, helping Violet with the horses, teaching Cora things Henrik had taught her decades ago. She became the grandmother the sisters never had, family built through choice and forgiveness and small kindnesses. When she died in the winter of 1896, they buried her next to Henrik. On her headstone, Violet carved, "Better late than never to find courage." Scout had preceded Ruth by 2 years. The old dog died on a warm afternoon in the summer of 1894, lying beneath the oak tree that had split and healed during the blizzard. He was 17 years old, ancient for a dog, as Henrik would have said. Violet found him there, his gray muzzle resting on his paws as if he had simply decided to sleep in the sun one last time. She knelt beside him and sang one of the Norwegian songs. Her voice broke on the final verse. They buried him in the shadow of the oak. Cora carved a simple stone marker. Scout, friend, loyal beyond death. Sometimes, on quiet evenings years later, Violet swore she could still hear his toenails clicking on the wooden floor. The phantom sound of devotion that outlasted everything. Silas Reed came to the farm more frequently after the blizzard, at first to rebuild the cabin, then to expand the tunnel, then simply because he wanted to, because his daughter Clara had attached herself to Violet, because Scout had decided Silas was pack, because Cora made him laugh. The shift from friendship to something more happened slowly. One afternoon in spring 1892, Cora was working on expanding the tunnel. Silas was helping her brace the new section. His hands worked with unconscious precision. Cora watched those hands and felt something shift in her chest. Recognition. Want. She had turned 20 that winter. He was 34, widowed, a father. A man who understood loss and loneliness. He looked up and caught her staring. Neither looked away. He said he had something to show her. He returned with a wooden box wrapped in cloth. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Inlaid on top was a tunnel entrance carved in darker wood with a rising sun behind it. He said he had made it for her, for the letters she would accumulate as the tunnel became famous. But Cora understood it was not about storage. It was about a carpenter finding a way to say things he had no words for. About a man learning to hope again after 3 years of grief. She took the box, ran her fingers over the smooth wood, said it was beautiful, said she had never owned anything so fine. Then she asked if he would like to stay for dinner. Silas said yes. His smile was small but real. That night marked the beginning of something. Not grand romance, but partnership. A growing toward each other. The slow building of trust between two people who had learned that love could be lost and found again. They married in spring 1893. A small ceremony with Ruth and Violet and Clara and the Methodist minister who had finally admitted a tunnel was practical, not ungodly. Silas gave Cora a wooden ring, later replaced with gold when consultation work brought real money. They had no children of their own. But Clara grew up calling Cora her second mother. She became a teacher in Ridgewater, teaching students about the tunnel and the winter that changed everything. Teaching them that knowledge passed down through generations could save lives, just as her grandmother Cora's mother had once taught in a schoolhouse that no longer stood. And Violet's children, when they came, would have an aunt and uncle who taught them that family was choice and loyalty and willingness to dig when the world said it was impossible. The tunnel expanded over years. By 1895, it was a network of chambers capable of sheltering 50 people and 30 animals. Other farms built their own versions. The knowledge spread, reaching people who needed it, saving lives. By 1923, Cora was 51, gray-haired, calloused hands. Her shoulder scar ached in cold weather, but she was alive. Silas was alive. Clara was grown with children of her own. Violet had married and published a book about the tunnel and their grandfather and the winter that changed everything. That year, researchers came from the University of Montana with new instruments. They spent 2 weeks documenting everything. When they emerged, they presented their findings. The hot spring was larger than Henrik realized. It fed the entire valley. The geothermal deposit could heat multiple shelters indefinitely. Caleb Morgan had been right about the value. He had just been wrong about what made it valuable. Not money, lives. Cora stood outside the tunnel that evening and looked at the hillside. The oak tree had grown back. Its split trunk healed into twisted strength. The cabin rebuilt and expanded. The land was now a demonstration site where people came to learn. She thought about her grandfather. About 13 years of silence she had interpreted as abandonment. About his letter explaining fear and love and the impossible choice between protecting someone and preparing them for survival. She understood now. Henrik had not abandoned them. He had known Caleb was hunting him, had sent them away to keep them safe, had spent his last years creating the knowledge they would need. It was not the choice she would have made, but it was a choice made from love. Imperfect and painful and ultimately successful. In 1958, Cora Stone Reed died in her sleep at 86. She was buried beside Henrik and Ruth and Silas. Her headstone read, "She trusted the earth and taught us to trust each other." In 1959, Violet Stone Larson, 84 and still writing, stood at her sister's grave with her grandchildren. The youngest asked her to tell the story again. Violet knelt eye level with the child. She said the story was not about digging. It was about different kinds of courage. Courage to trust knowledge that seemed like madness. Courage to forgive. Courage to keep building when everything collapsed. Courage to open doors for people who called you a fool. She said her sister taught her that Earth kept two kinds of warmth. Physical warmth from deep places that kept your body alive, and the other warmth, the harder warmth, the kind that came from choosing mercy over revenge. The child asked which was more important. Violet looked at the tunnel entrance, still visible after 70 years. She said both were necessary. You needed Earth's warmth to survive. But you needed the other warmth to make survival worth it, to make life more than just not dying. The grandchildren asked to see inside. Violet nodded. Not too old to climb down into the earth one more time. They descended together. The tunnel was wider now, better lit, maintained by the Montana Historical Society. But the core was unchanged, still Henrik's design, still proving that knowledge passed down through generations could save lives. Violet stood in the main chamber and closed her eyes. She could hear Cora's voice, Scout's toenails clicking on stone, horses shifting, wind howling. The silence when it finally stopped. When she emerged, her grandchildren asked if she was crying. She said no, just the temperature change, but they were tears. For Cora and Henrik and Ruth and Silas. For Margaret, who learned to be brave. For Scout, who loved beyond death. For all of it. The hard parts and warm parts woven into something that looked like a life well lived. That night, Violet wrote the final chapter of her book. She titled it The Warmth Beneath the Hill and dedicated it to Cora. The last line read, "My sister was right about the earth, but she was wrong too, because the greatest warmth does not come from the ground. It comes from forgiveness, from opening doors for people who hurt you, from choosing to save rather than condemn. That is the warmth that never fades." In 2023, the tunnel was still there, still functional, still maintaining constant 56 degrees, 134 years after Cora and Violet Stone first broke ground. The earth keeps its promises. If you are patient enough to dig, brave enough to trust, stubborn enough to keep going when everyone calls you a fool. And sometimes you learn that warmth is not just physical. It is knowing you survived, knowing you saved others, knowing that even broken things can be forgiven. Even two girls alone in Montana can dig a hole that changes everything. The warmth endures. In the earth beneath our feet, holding its 56 degrees for 134 years and counting. In the choices we make when hate would be easier than mercy. In the doors we open when closing them would feel like justice. In the knowledge we pass down, generation to generation, because survival is not just about living. It is about making sure others can live too. That is the warmth that never fades. And that is enough